Our next speaker is Daniel Franklin. He is the executive editor of The Economist, which is, of course, one of the most highly respected magazines in the world. It's read by business leaders and public leaders everywhere. His book on long-term trends, Mega Change: The World in 2050, was published back a year ago in March of 2012. Daniel joins us from London. Let's give him a big Florida welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Particularly nice not to be in London right now, so lovely to be in sunny Florida when it's sleeting back in London. As you just heard, I'm going to talk about mega change, the world in 2050, and mega change is, as just described, change happening at an extraordinary speed with great impact on the world, and I'm particularly looking at the coming decades. And here's one. Perhaps the most important example, population change. This is a chart of the change in population, the time it took to get to the first billion people on the planet. It took 250,000 years to reach our first billion on the Earth. The latest billion was added from 6 to 7 billion, was added in just 12 years. So what took 250,000 years has just happened in 12 years. Now, it's going to slow down and it's going to stabilize towards the middle of the century, but that still means that we are going to get, between now and 2050, an extra 2.3 billion people on Earth. So we'll have 9 billion plus people by 2050. That itself is extraordinary, but when you look at where those people are, and if you start to delve beneath the surface, you discover that, first of all, we're going to be much more urban. 50% of people now live in towns of cities. It'll be close to 70% by then. So the problems of mankind are essentially going to be urban problems. We're going to be older, about 9 years older on average. And if you look at where people will be living, about half of these extra 2 billion people on the planet will be in Africa. So if you want to know where tomorrow's workforce is going to be, where tomorrow's young people are going to be, an awful lot of them are going to be in Africa. And if you look at the types of problems, issues that people are going to be dealing with because of these population trends, very broadly, 3 groups of countries it's worth thinking about. The first group of countries are those which have a dynamic population, very rapidly going, very young population. Africa, as I've just mentioned, Middle East, and India is another country that has a fast-growing population. In the middle group of countries, those that have aging, but not too dramatically. The United States is one of those, Southeast Asia, much of Latin America. And then you have a third group of countries that's going to be aging extremely rapidly. In some cases, their population's actually shrinking. A lot of Europe, Italy, Germany, shrinking populations, for example. Japan, which is hitting these problems sooner than anybody else. And then the final one, which will surprise many of you after what you've just heard, China. Because of the one-child policy, China is going to be starting to age very rapidly before very long. So it really is in a race to become rich before it grows old. Now, I've dwelt a little bit on those population issues because they're so important and they influence so many other of these big changes that will be happening in the decades ahead. Here are a few other examples of mega change. These are covers from The Economist. The one there that you see on the left was we did when women hit 50% of the workforce in the United States, a landmark social change. Obviously, gay marriage has become a huge item in the news, actually, in many, many countries right now. In the corporate world, it's extraordinary that a company like Facebook comes from nowhere to be, about 1 billion people are members of Facebook now. That, if it were a country, would be the 3rd biggest country in the world. The other cover that we had was of Steve Jobs with introducing his tablet, and in no time at all, the iPad has become part of so many people's lives and used not only for work, but in schools and for recreation as well. So if we look ahead, there are various dangers about forecasting the future. As you know, it's a very perilous business. This is one, actually, my wife is sitting in the audience here. It's one close to her heart, obesity. She looks at me and thinks that this is a bit of a picture of me becoming ever fatter. But this is actually the numbers for America becoming ever fatter. You heard about obesity this morning. But the question is, do we carry on going fatter and fatter and fatter until we pop? I very much hope that the answer to that is no, and for a very good reason, that you start having a reaction to that. You have all sorts of government policies that say, no, you have to have information on the foods, you have to behave responsibly, you have educational programs, you have corporations coming under pressure to give healthier foods, you have schools trying to have more exercise, and so on and so forth. So I hope that this won't just be an extrapolated trend way off in the future, or we really are in very deep trouble. Another very topical issue, inequality. You just heard it being talked about in the context of China. It has, of course, been a huge issue for America and actually in Europe as well. The top 1% disproportionately gaining from the impacts of technology and from globalization. And the question is, does this carry on? Does the world carry on getting more and more unequal? And again, I think the answer is probably not, that there is a response. You see actually part of the response happening right now. Only last week you just heard about how unequal China is. Well, the Chinese government just came out with a raft of policies to try and tackle this issue. You see tax policies changing around Europe. That's happened before, that in response to rising inequality, the robber barons in the United States, government, public policy changed. 100 years ago, this year, the first federal income tax was introduced, partly as a response to that. The rate then, by the way, was just 7%, would you believe? Here's another example, the size of the state. We hear how big we know how much bigger the state is becoming in many, many countries, taking a bigger and bigger share of tax and our economic well-being. Can that continue? Again, I think probably not. There will be a reaction against it. You see already the political movement rebelling against it in many countries, including in the United States. And we've seen in, for example, Nordic countries, where they hit even higher levels of the state as a share of the economy than, say, in countries that you think of having a very high level, such as France. And they reacted, they responded, and they've started to bring it down. Very likely that something similar will happen in many other countries too. If you look at the economy, what are some of the big changes to expect, the big trends to look at? Well, here's one. This map shows what is now a persistent difference in growth level between the emerging economies and the rich world. The emerging economies in the green line at the top, the rich world at the bottom, the red line. And this has just carried on and been accentuated through the economic crisis. This is why in every boardroom of internationally minded companies around the world, the emerging economies are grabbing so much attention, because this is where the growth is. This is an example of the big changes in global economic power that have been happening. It's a lovely graphic. I like this one because it's a Mount Fuji shape. It shows Japan's share, the Japanese economy as a percentage of the US economy. And you can see how in the 1980s it was going up and up and up. And that was at the time, if you remember, that people in America in particular were very worried about being overtaken by Japan. That Japan was going to become a greater economic power than the United States. And then a strange thing happened. Japan stagnated, America continued to forge ahead, and that mountain started its downslope, the other side of Fuji, if you like. And then the red at the bottom, that's China coming up, just overtaking Japan to be a bigger economy than Japan. And as you've just heard, a debate now about when exactly China will become a bigger economy than the United States. On our website at The Economist, we have various assumptions of economic growth and currencies and so on. and the number we come up with is perhaps 2018. It's really not very far away. It depends how you measure it, as you've heard, but that will be a very mind-concentrating moment for America. And this is, again, a version of the chart you just saw from Jamie, a sense of how this is really the normal state of affairs. We're going back to the future. For 1,000 years of economic history, which this chart shows, Asia was by far the biggest economic producer in the world. The lion's share, in fact, of the world economy was produced in Asia. And then what happened with the Industrial Revolution in particular was that Europe, first of all, starting to rise up and overtaking Asia, then the United States rising up and overtaking Asia, and now that's starting to reverse. Asia is growing very, very fast, is overtaking both Europe and America, and in fact, by 2050, we'll be back at about half the global output. And that, as you can see, is really back to the future, the normal historical state of affairs. Well, if you look again to the future, you're bound to get surprises. You would have all have heard of black swans. This is a particularly nice black swan, Natalie Portman. Black swans are surprising events that happen out of nowhere. Well, here are a few, perhaps, surprises, things that might surprise you that could happen in the coming decades. A booming Middle East reaping the economic benefits of its what's called a demographic dividend. That's what I talked about at the beginning, a very, very young population that we'll have. That young population in the Middle East is both a huge opportunity, if you can find work for all these young people that are going to be living there. And by the way, you could see the recent political upheavals that we've been seeing in the Middle East as part of, you can see it through the demographic prism. All these young people, it's an early manifestation of the sort of upheaval that can happen when you have so many, such a big share of young people in the population. But they have an opportunity. Put all these people to work and they will have one of the fastest growing economic regions in the world. China, by contrast, because of its aging population, slowing down by the end of this sort of period, 4 decades hence, to a much more modest growth rate of perhaps 2.5% a year, rather similar to America as its population ages and it just can't throw more and more resources to keep the economy growing. Nigeria, I mentioned Africa as being the place where so many young people are going to be living. The biggest country in population terms in Africa is Nigeria. It's going to have 400 million people or so by 2050. That'll be almost as many people as will be in the United States by then. So Nigeria, if you want to add another economy to the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, these big emerging markets, Nigeria is really the African contender to join that group. And then more fancifully in the scientific realm, perhaps, the discovery of alien life. Quite probable with all the planets that we're now looking at that sort of thing will happen. And one of the contributors to the book actually thinks we're going to have almost sort of Jurassic Park-like the rebirth of extinct species. You heard about innovation earlier on this afternoon, and a planet of 9 billion people is going to depend for its survival on innovation in all sorts of areas. And I just wanted to highlight just a few areas that I think are ripe for it. I think biology is where the real action is going to be in science. We have huge advances happening through the discovery of the genome and then the application of computing power to that. So I think that's an area of great excitement. The whole area of what's sometimes called three-dimensional manufacturing has the potential to completely change the way that we make things, and along with it, where we make them and in how big a quantity we make batches of manufactured products. So I think the sort of manufacturing world that we've become used to over the past 50 or so years is going to change fundamentally, partly a result of that. And this was expressed in this cover story of The Economist, Print Me a Stradivarius. And then finally, we're going to need huge innovation in agricultural technology just to feed these 9 billion people on the planet. It's perfectly possible, but it is a big challenge. So then finally, I just wanted to give you a sense of what all this means, what all this might mean for the corporate world. I know there are a lot of corporate leaders among you. So here's a sort of fantasy top 10 companies, because you all love lists, I know, and you all love rankings. Top 10 companies of the world in 2050. What might it look like? So, Global Corp 2050. The biggest company is, of course, still a natural resources company, only it's no longer just oil. It's oil. Water has become a key commodity in this world of 2040, so it's Exxon Hydro. Number 2, Tata buys Microsoft. Apologies if there's anybody from Microsoft in the audience. Tata, a big Indian software company, becomes the giant in that space called TataSoft. Well, of course, Google buys Goldman Sachs, and we have a banking giant that quickly becomes known as GGS to everybody. Google knows everything about you, knows all about your risk profile, so it's ideal to take over this space. You all know about sovereign wealth funds. Well, they're going to have a lot of money. They're going to be buying up an awful lot of stuff. Qatar, actually one of the fastest growing economies at the moment because of all its gas, becomes a huge player in that space. Chinese are still the giants in traditional manufacturing, so Shanghai Automotive becomes the great leader in car manufacturing. This is the logical extension of all the pharmaceutical mergers that you've ever heard of, so I won't even begin to try and pronounce that. Education, as you've all been knowing, is key. Oxbridge, Harvard is the category killer in education. They get together and deliver courses around the world. And then I've just had 2 because you saw from the Facebook example, companies come from nowhere and become world leaders. So I've invented 2 just to give a taster of what that might be. Talentiate, the world of talent, is a hugely important thing. Talentiate is a company that finds the magic formula for that. Manuvation is a company that is the one that emerges from this 3-dimensional manufacturing to be the leader in that area. And then finally, what better company could there be than the combination of Bollywood and Disney, Bollydiz. The world in 2050, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed.